Mr. Chakravarti and friends, let me say at the start that I was really rather delighted to get this invitation. I was delighted because I think it's a great occasion honoring a very, very special academic, honoring a very special human being. And also, it's an occasion in which the institution that she belongs to will show that it also cherishes her memory. And I think that's terribly important in our country today, that when we have worthwhile people, their memories should be cherished. After I got the invitation, I had previously looked a little bit at her writings, but nothing very much, because, as I always say, it was not my area of specialization. But after that, I don't know if you can hear me.
Volume.
The mic goes and after that, now can you hear me?
Yeah.
After that, I decided to read some of her writings, and I must say I was riveted by a lot that I read, and at the end of it, I was deeply impressed, because I had really never gone through what she had written quite seriously and at length. So I feel in many ways that it is a kind of double level of honor to be asked to give this lecture. It is not only in memory of a very special person, but it is also in memory of an extremely impressive scholar. Now, let me just introduce the lecture by saying that I'm not going to be talking about anything new. I will be repeating a lot of what you said. And I'm also cheating, because at the end of what I will be saying, I'm simply going to pose a number of questions in the hope that eventually later on you as scholars will pay attention to some of these questions. For a long time, the history of what is often being described as women in ancient India was a reiteration of what was said about women in the Dharma-shastras, but perhaps with a slightly more positive gloss. It was assumed that these texts were largely descriptions of how society functioned. In recent decades, this view has been questioned. We find that Manu's code, for instance, was more normative and concerned with codes of behavior than descriptive, and not as prevalent as it was thought to be. Its prevalence varied in time and degree in relation to particular societies. When non-Brahmanical sources and more secular literature were found to contradict the Brahmanical codes, the subject became more problematic. And that's where we are at the moment, the problematic of the subject. For the period that I shall be commenting on, namely from the Maurya to the Gupta, with a few extensions, the sources tend to bifurcate. Some adhere to the Brahmanical perspective and others to the Shamanic, primarily Buddhist and Jain. They are not too far apart in time, yet they present different perspectives. This is particularly so in the visibility that they give to the perception of women. I tend to view this difference through the prism of what we sometimes refer to as renunciation. This might throw up some interesting questions, as for instance, why this visibility is prominent in shamanic thinking and less so in the other. My focus is on women who renounce what we think of as the conventional social code. Some chose to join the Buddhist Sangha, discarding the Dharmashastras as definitive social codes. Such women may perhaps be seen more as contestants than renouncers, but nevertheless should not be overlooked in assessing social attitudes. Forms that I have often called opting out of society were not unconnected to social norms. A few decades ago, when I first wrote on renunciation in early India, I questioned the ideas of Louis Dumont, who described it as being a life-negating principle. I argued that, on the contrary, apart from its being a path to nirvana, enlightenment, it led to exploring other aspects of life. Some categories of renouncers, for this and other reasons, became authoritative figures within the society. He who labors, shram, to gain enlightenment acquires moral authority through this labor and liberates not only himself or herself from rebirth, but others as well through the teaching. The question remains whether those that lived lives contrary to the code of money were actually edged out of society as advised by the code, or on the contrary were respected. Renouncers seeking nirvana were neither negating life nor intending to entirely change society. They were attempting to establish an alternative space and a system that would make liberation more accessible. Inevitably, theirs was a dissenting voice, discarding the mores of orthodoxy. Movements for change can depart radically from the existing systems, or else become a kind of osmosis where ideas governing a new mode of social living are practiced by small groups. Ideas are thereby inducted into influencing the larger society. If the small alternate society cannot be sustained, then the group becomes marginal and fades away. The history of renouncers in India seems to suggest that renunciation nurtured what I would like to call the counterculture as a parallel society. Renouncers therefore remain part of the social landscape. They are not isolated ascetics who live in inaccessible areas like mountaintops, single-mindedly focused on their own liberation, rather than the creation of a parallel society. That the death rites are performed for the Brahman ascetic when he decides there's protection to what I'm saying. That the death rites are performed for the Brahman ascetic when he decides to take sannyasa is a telling statement. Such asceticism is known, but is not that frequently practiced. Asceticism, therefore, is distinct from renunciation, and I would like you to keep this in mind. If we argue that opting out of a conservative social system, as envisaged in the Dharmashastras, is intended to encourage a parallel society, then we have to consider how the constituent society relates to each other. It also requires us to observe what of orthodox beliefs and social codes were renounced, and yet renouncers were accommodated in society. Social mores, of course, can only be made functional if they are accepted by or imposed upon women. Women are crucial. This explains Manu's insistence on not giving women a voice lest they protest. It is in the nature of social codes to treat defiant groups as somehow removed from society, or only to be referred to indirectly. Caste rules do not apply if one renounces one's role in society. If one's status is anyway regarded as inferior, as is that of women, then breaking the code is perhaps not such an outrageous crime, except for better placed upper caste women. It is not surprising that elements of renunciation become more visible in the activities of women than of men. Subordinated groups, when they break their subordination, attract attention. I would like to look first at the Buddhist sources that are more descriptive than normative, although they too can give an ideological figure to what they say, as for instance in observing the rules of membership of the Sangha. The levels of society, when viewed from the perspective of women's activities, as I shall try and do in this lecture, constitute three broad categories that were not unconnected. Within each category were women of status, as well as women of less or little or no status, the latter being more invisible in the sources. I shall try and present these categories first horizontally across society and then vertically within each group. So the first. The most eminent and visible category was that of the Griha-Patni, the wife of the householder. In a general sense, households included persons of authority, members of the ruling clans and the Ganasanghas, royal families and kingdoms, and wealthy merchants residing in urban centers. These being persons of substance, their wives were treated as ladies of consequence, and not just any housewife. The chief wife, often the first, married in accordance with the rules of patriarchy, bore the children that would inherit the wealth and the status. The girls in this category would have access to their mother's inheritance, perhaps the Strizana. In the early history of Buddhism, women from this space, the Griha-Patnis, and their daughters were the source of women renouncers. Permission from husbands and fathers was frequently given, and sometimes even the men followed suit, if the Buddhist texts are to be believed. The Griha-Patni complains of the pain of being a co-wife or giving birth to a child, but she did at least have the option of becoming a nun, provided her husband agreed. The poorer Griha-Patni dreams of release from the vessel, release from the husband and the water pot, if she could become a nun, but it was not so easy to get the requested permission. Households of lesser status are referred to, but their activities find less place in the records of the early Buddhists. The upper caste Griha-Patnis had the option of becoming nuns, as they were not helping to bring in the income. Income earners were the women in peasant and artisan households, where, in some occupations, the women had to share the wealth with their husbands, and therefore hardly had the option of opting out. At a much lower level, but essential to the relatively well-off household, was the dasi, the woman who fetched water, shopped, kept the home clean, washed clothes, ground rice, cooked, and attended to the lady of the house. She was the essential cog in the household machine. If need be, she also had to offer her services to the master or to the male guests. This latter requirement is confirmed from other sources as well. One Upanishad mentions Jabala, who was unclear about his caste as his mother worked as a Dasi in our household and was unable to identify his father. There is also the reference to the curious anomaly of what are called the Dasi Putra Brahmins in the Vedic texts. Reviled at first by regular Brahmins, they were subsequently eagerly recruited into the Brahmin caste when their supernatural powers were revealed. What mattered was the caste of the father, therefore the mother could well be a Dasi. The Dasi was essentially unfree and had no inheritance to fall back upon. She could be freed either if she bore the master of the household a child, or if the master agreed to her manumission. Her life was virtually in the hands of the man who claimed ownership over her. The Dasi did not have the freedom to join the Sangha without the consent of the master. Judging by the infrequency of their numbers, the permission may often have been withheld. Dasis would, of course, bring little social status to the institution, and in the context of the household, the Griha-Patni and the Dasi represent the two extremes of relative freedom and unfreedom. I would now like to turn to the women involved perhaps in a more direct aspect of opting out, in part revolving around their sexuality. Two categories that transgressed Manu's code were nuns and courtesans. Their contestation, however, was based on diametrically opposite premises and requirements. For those that became nuns, renunciation was a form of distancing from society, but the courtesan reasserted an involvement in society, although contesting accepted norms. Joining the Sangha meant becoming a bhikkhuni, a nun, a condition directly opposed to that of the Griha-Patni, but the ties seem not to have been totally severed. The nun was no longer a housewife, as she lived in a collective. She had no family to care for since she did not marry, or if already married, did not have access to her husband. She could meet her family of siblings and relatives, if so required. That she made donations to the Sangha is suggestive of some continuing ties with the family and possible access to at least a little wealth. Women could become nuns and establish their lives in nunneries. It meant leaving the comfort of home to live in a rather austere monastery, to be shorn, to dress in rough uniform clothes, to eat whatever came by way of alms from the village or town, observing no rules of commensality or caste, and to be strictly celibate, to spend time in prayer and meditations, and where necessary, help other women in distress. Joining the order was in itself an act of breaking the social code, as dictated for women in the normative Brahmanical texts, and acting contrary to the rules of caste and patriarchy. But it also meant submitting to the alternate code, that of the Sangha. The initial hesitation in recruiting women to the Buddhist Sangha did not last for long, but the nun was always to be subservient to the monk. There are narratives about those who were well versed in the teachings of the Buddha and respected for this. Women teachers and philosophers are associated in Indian traditions with asking penetrating questions, but none established schools of thought. Gandhi and Maitreyi asked questions, so did Gautami and others, but the questions did not lead to new doctrines. Whereas the term Arya was regularly used for monks who taught, such a title was not given to the nuns who also taught. Older nuns knew the doctrine equally well, since they ordained the new nuns. Sanghamitra, said to be the daughter of Ashok Maurya, travelled to Sri Lanka in order to ordain the queen and women of the Sinhala royal family. It has been suggested that the Devavansa, the earlier chronicle of the Mahavihara monastery in Sri Lanka, may have been written by nuns, since this has much on the activities of nuns. This would suggest, not surprisingly, that scholarship could be a part of the curriculum in nunnery. Some nuns are said to be skilled debaters, as was Bhadra Kundalakeshi, who was eventually defeated by Sariputra, a senior disciple of the Buddha. A particularly accomplished nun can claim a long ancestry, going back to the time of an earlier Buddha. But however well she may have known the doctrine, she did not depart from the teaching. This the monks could do up to a point, and establish a new sect, as happened after discussions in various councils. In the lower register of the declared supporters of Buddhism were the women who were the lay followers, the upasikas. These were generally women of the household, who performed the required rituals, made donations to the Sangha, and went on pilgrimages. Their activities are recorded in votive inscriptions at stupa sites. They may not have had access to great wealth, but seem to have had some control over household finances, or at least some access, to enable them to make donations. Lay followers often identify themselves by associating their family with the donation. The third category was of women whose activity was diametrically opposed, both to that of the women of the household and of the nuns. These were the women who became ganikas, or courtesans, and are essentially a part of the urban scene. In terms of continuities, one could say that the courtesan had the Apsara as her ancestress, and in post-Gupta times, the Ganika, in turn, was the partial ancestress to the Devadasis. Similarity also lies in the occasional references to the Ganika being the daughter of a Ganika, an idea that is repeated in the Manimekalai. Some have therefore suggested that this is a characteristic of a matrilineal system, but a distinctive kinship system, such as matrimony, is not associated with the Ganikas, even though they deviated completely from the patriarchal household. There is again a need to make a distinction, even in this category, between the courtesan and the prostitute or the sex worker. The terms used in the text do not consistently demarcate between them, but there is a considerable difference in reality. The courtesan had to be trained in music, dance, the arts, good conversation. Qualifications required of her before she could set herself up in her profession. It was her accomplishments and her physical beauty that led the citizens of her city to respect her. She upheld a particular culture. Historians have compared the Ganika with the Hetera of the Greek city-states. There is a similarity of function, but the Hetera was often from another city. Indian cities of this period seem to have had a strong sense of identity, and association with the city was prized. A case in point, of course, is the much-quoted Ambapani, who was adopted by the city of Vaishali, the courtesan Ambapani. The courtesan was generally without a family, a child more often being accidental. Caste rules were repeatedly broken in her dealings with her clients, even if she had the freedom to choose her clients. Her actions discounted patriarchy in her giving priority to the erotic over and above social codes. The prostitute at the lowest level in this category, referred to as Desha and Rupajini, was also part of the urban scene. She was untrained in any of the arts, had no status other than what was viewed as rather routine sexual work. The prostitute services were open to all, whereas the courtesan could choose her clients, and generally chose from amongst the wealthiest. For the prostitute, this was employment and income, whereas for the courtesan, it presumably brought enjoyment as well. She offered both pleasure and companionship. The difference between the two lies, as it has been said, in asking as to what is being treated as a commodity. There is nothing new in all that I have said so far. I have summarized the picture just to remind you of what we know. When differentiating between categories of women, it is useful to see how these categories are connected. One of the ways of doing this is to see the binary opposition implicit in their social locations, both between categories and within them. Such oppositions do not have sharply demarcated boundaries. In some situations, there is a fuzziness at the edges that confirms the reality of what is being described. We have then what might be called the opposition at the horizontal level, which is the established status of the housewife in her husband's household, which is counter to the other two categories of the nun and the courtesan. The nun lives in the collective of the nunnery and is celibate. The courtesan exploits her erotic abilities, but her sexuality is not intended for the procreation of children. So, the Grihavatni is contrapuntal to both the nun and the courtesan. And the latter two are contrapuntal to each other. The horizontal binaries at the lower level are more fluid. It is the Upasika who stands in contradistinction to the Dasi and the Vaishya, but she is also a part of the Grihavatni. The vertical binaries lie within each category and at each end of the spectrum. The Grihavatni is socially respected. At the other end is the Dasi, treated as inferior, but whose labor keeps the household going. She was often treated as trafficked. Manu lists her together with animals when referring to the wealth of the household. The Upasika brings in the donations for the Sangha, but it is the Bhikkhuni who propagates Buddhism. The Vaishya caters to the demand in urban centers for sex workers, but it is the accomplished Ganika who receives the accolades from the city dwellers. These binaries reflect relationships among women, but are also dependent on men. The Grihavatni keeps the household and the family together around the fulcrum of the Grihavatni. The nuns, however respected they may have been, had always to obey the decisions of the monk, and this was conditional to their ordination as nuns. Some Upasikas made individual donations, but quite a few were on behalf of the family. The courtesan was dependent on male clients, but of her choice. The sex worker had to service all that came, since she had no status. When viewed from the perspective of these binaries, the separation between the three categories is not insurmountable, but is clear. The nun could have been the wife, daughter, or widow of a householder, or come from the courtesan's establishment. A courtesan could marry a client and set up a house and start a family. Apostate nuns are not mentioned, presumably because it would be bad publicity for the Sangha. There were some links across the three categories. there were also connections of various kinds within each category. The Dasi is unfree, as is the sex worker, both at the lower levels. There are references to both seeking the freedom of joining the Sangha, but the frequency of this is limited. The question that now needs asking is whether the other tradition, the Brahmanical, despite its difference with the Sharanite, reflects these categories, both as an idea and an institutional form. The Grihapatni and Dasi are common to both, whereas the Dasi receives the same treatment in both traditions. The Grihapatni in the Brahmanical codes is a more subservient woman. Would she, for instance, have tried to persuade her husband to become a monk, as did some of the women in the Buddhist texts? Even where royal women made endowments to the Sangha in the early centuries, as for instance the Ikshvaku royalty, their husbands continued to perform daily sacrifices. Admittedly, this may have been politically expedient. Brahmanical sects treated monks and nuns as alien categories. Teaching the Vedas to women was anyway forbidden. The occasional mendicant, male or female, is referred to in the Dharma Shastras and is known from other sources. However, the female mendicant is mentioned in the Arthashastra together with the somewhat suspicious and degraded professions of actors, bards, and others who wander. She is differentiated from the shaven-headed Shudra woman ascetic, presumably the nun, who is mentioned in passing in a Purana. She has a prominent role, the mendicant, the female mendicant, as a spy for a government, a role that is so heavily emphasized that it almost appears to be the definition of a female mendicant. Female donors, barring the royal family, are not so well defined as is the Upasika in Buddhist sources, and do not receive much publicity. The Brahmanical tradition has little space for female donors in the early centuries, barring members of the royal family. Even when temples become conspicuous on the landscape, a range of donors were not to the fore, as they were, for instance, in Sanchi, Bahru, and other Buddhist sites. In the triangle of connections that I have suggested, it is almost as if nuns and lay women were expunged, with goddesses replacing them, as amongst those who nurture religion. The third category, that of the courtesan and the prostitute, are prominently mentioned in the Arthashastra. But here they have a clear-cut role. They provide income for the state exchequer. The state pays 24,000 paranas to acquire, to buy, a courtesan, the same amount as is paid to the upper bureaucracy as a salary. It also provides an endowment of 1,000 paranas for her to set up her establishment. Her earnings then are taxed by the state, and she is obviously seen as a good investment. The condition and work of the courtesans is controlled by a state official, the Ganik Adhyaksha, and an entire chapter of the Arthashastra is devoted to his work. For a society required to function according to the rules of Manu's code, this does seem a rather cynical attitude to human relations. It is different in spirit from the admiration for the accomplished Ganika in Buddhist texts, who is free to donate her property to the Sangha as some do. Prostitutes are not in state service, but all the same have to pay a regular monthly tax to the state. This amounts, it is said, to twice their one-time fee. It would seem that the state has no inhibitions in treating sex work on par with the normal roster of taxable occupations, and additionally in utilizing sex workers as spies. Muhammad does not describe the courtesan. He only refers to prostitutes and calls them ganetas and treats them with contempt. The Arthashastra and Manu take rather different positions from each other and from the Buddhist texts. Given all this complexity, it does become incumbent upon historians when speaking about women in various traditions to consider which category and status is being discussed, and by whom and when. The women in the top half of the categories claim status as patrons, donors, and qualified persons, whereas those in the lower half keep the essentials going. They each have different support systems: husbands, employers, the Sangha, the family, their own establishment, and state protection. Keeping body and soul together is not central to the renouncer, but at the same time it cannot be ignored. The household was at the core of production. It drew its wealth either from the cultivable land owned by the householder or from the artisanal and commercial enterprises that he may have controlled, or in some cases, both. When monasteries began receiving grants of land and instituted what Max Weber has called monastic landlordism, the agricultural wealth was immense. No less was the wealth that came from domestic and cross-continental trade. Recent scholarship informs us that the monasteries were also involved in commerce, both as staging points along trade routes and as investors. Traders and monks carried cargo and religion to distant places. This might partially explain the hostility towards the shamanic sects in Brahmanical texts, apart from their strong ideological differences. The Shamanas are described as Nastika, non-believers, Veda-Nindaka, reviling the Vedas, Pashakta, fraudulent, Mahamoha, the great deceivers. The two recognized streams of dharma, the Brahman and the Shaman, are clearly mentioned as an antagonistic duality by Sanskrit grammarians. Their relationship is compared to that of the snake and the mongoose, or the cat and the mouse. In terms of social differentiation, there was expectedly an emphasis on caste and sectarian diversities. The Purans deny freedom from rebirth to men and women belonging to the Shamana sects, and Manu, of course, ostracized them. Religion and caste intersected, and religions that were open to all were automatically demoted in social ranking. But Nirvana had no social boundaries. Nuns, who when they claim some degree of enlightenment, speak excitedly of having split open the mass of mental darkness and describe themselves as having become cool and free. The nun carries a reminder of the autonomy of the woman. This is contrary to a code where the woman is, in theory, completely dependent on father, husband, and son, and is not allowed the will of her own. Although mendicants of various sects do wander around, there are no orders of monks and nuns except amongst the shaman. Renunciation is ideally an individual act of separation from society. As such, it does not occur with great frequency in Brahmanical sects, whose identity was tied to caste. What is surprising is that the Brahmanical code, when speaking of women, gives little space to a nun, even of the other dharmas. Was this because the Dharma Shastras were meant only for a limited upper caste usage, focusing on what men should be doing, and therefore nuns had to be invisible? Yet it was from the upper castes that initially there were larger numbers of nuns joining nunneries. We have to remember that although in theory all religions had a place for renouncers, few maintained institutions for them, such as monasteries and nunneries. It is not my intention to discuss the religious and social reasons for this, which would be a very interesting discussion. But suffice it to say that well-defined orders of monks and nuns are largely to be found only in Christianity, in Buddhism, and in Jainism. Renunciation in Christianity began with a literal resort to isolation. The example that is always quoted is Simeon's stylite, who sat on the top of a pillar in the Egyptian desert. When people gathered around these desert fathers, as they came to be called, they created a new community. But by medieval times in Europe, it had taken the form of well-established monasteries and nunneries. Wealth gained from various sources. Eileen Power, in her brilliant study of medieval European society, provides some pointers. Fathers, when they dedicated their daughters to the church, often had to give a dowry as well. Nuns could not inherit land, so daughters likely to receive such inheritance were forced to become nuns by their brothers. But institutions took advantage of this, and some endowment accompanied the nun to be. Girls from poor families, therefore, had problems being accepted as nuns. Since everyone, St. Augustine says, since everyone was born of original sin, much of the nun's time was spent in prayer, praying not just for her life after death, but for others as well. The nun is often referred to as the bride of Christ, and is interpreted as a metaphor at many levels. The nuns practiced what were called feminine crafts, such as spinning, weaving, and embroidery. But they were also taught Latin, together with the art of illuminating manuscripts. Inevitably, some texts were read and discussed. This explains the emergence in the 12th century of now the very famous nun Hildegard von Bingen, who, confined to a Benedictine convent, nevertheless wrote on theology and contributed compositions to early church music. Since she suffered from severe migraine, she had amazing visions that she relied upon to explain the Bible. But visions apart, the nuns did contribute to the construction of some European cultural forms. Why are such women not known or less known among Buddhist nuns? Maybe I don't know. Music of any complicated kind, as well as Catholic chants, may not have been part of Buddhist ritual. The initial absence of deities perhaps reduced the need for visions, but the copying of manuscripts and commenting on them should have opened up other possibilities. Puranic Hinduism from the late 1st millennium AD, as distinct from the earlier Vedic Brahmanism, did finally recognize, perhaps a little grudgingly, the legitimacy of women propagating their religious ideas. But orders of nuns were not established. These were not the women mendicants who were paid to spy for the state, but were women devotees of the Bhakti movement, independent women of intense religious belief. They contributed substantially to giving form to the Bhakti manifestations of Hinduism, often defined conservative belief and practice. The considerable literary quality and religious content of the compositions of some among them are now being recognized. The earliest form was in the south from the later millennium, 1st millennium AD. In the north it was more familiar in the 2nd millennium. Initially, it was men and women that wandered through town and village that taught these new religious ideas. Among them, Akka Mahadevi has been and is frequently quoted. Much is made of the claim that she married the deity she worshipped, always amalgamated with the deity. Was this a rejection of a human husband or of implicit sexuality? One is reminded, of course, of the Christian nun becoming the bride of Christ. Two of the more popular women devotees in North India were Lalde, Laleshwari in Kashmir, and Mirabai in Rajasthan. They were upper caste women and had problems with their conservative families, whom they finally separated from. Accepted popularly as among the highest devotees, they used the commonly understood language rather than the language of the learned. Their religion was therefore quite distinct from the religion that was being constructed in the muchs, open only to the Brahmins. Some muchs organized an informal order of monks for propagating their ideas. Was this an imitation of the Buddhists and the Jains, or possibly even a Brahmanical assertion to counter the popularity of some of the Bhakti teachers, although the audiences were different? But of course, there was no Brahmanical order of nuns. Nevertheless, the lifestyle of the women preaching Bhakti broke the social code of the Dharmashastra. They were no longer Grihapatis, nor did they observe the rules of commensality. They led wandering lives. The woman devotee, even if tenuously associated with Puranic Hinduism, did not belong to an institution as did the Buddhist nuns. These women were sustained by a small following. Their caste status probably gave them some leeway in disregarding caste rules. The Buddhist nuns had been recruited into an alternate parallel society and had institutional support. They underwent a formal training, they were literate and learned the texts required for their ordination. The institution had its own hierarchy of office from novice to superior and its own regulations about appearance and daily routine. Nuns were not entirely cut off from their families, nor from receiving small family gifts. Such institutionalized support was almost necessary for the survival of the nunneries. This was evident by the manner in which they declined when patronage was discontinued by the early 2nd millennium AD, and Buddhism itself was fading out in most parts of India. Both nuns and women devotees discarded the code of Manu in rejecting the centrality of being a dutiful daughter, a subservient wife, and an uncomplaining widow. In societies conforming to the Buddhist tradition, the emphasis was less on the binary of conformity and non-conformity vis-à-vis caste rules. They looked for a legitimate alternate space for those that wished to be renouncers. The Brahmanical tradition was more severe on non-conformists who were contesting orthodox caste norms and for which there were penalties. Meera would not have been accused of being immoral had she joined a nunnery. But then, the nunneries were there only for the Jain converts and the occasional Bhakti sect such as the Mahanishava. The alternate society of the Buddhist Sangha provided protection from oppressive norms, but it also required that nuns obey the rules of the Sangha, the nuns having voluntarily chosen to join it. There were rules, these were rules the nuns could not change on their own. And in some ways, this forecloses the freedom of renunciation, in that even if one breaks caste rules, one has to take on the rules of the Sangha. I would like to think that we have reached a point where we might investigate, now as scholars and historians, we might investigate the awareness of counterculture among women. These range from renunciation in order to join a religious order to renouncing social conventions in order to discover individual self-expression. The shamanic traditions provided accessible opportunities for the first via the institution of the Sangha, whereas the Bhakti and the Shakta traditions seem to follow the second. Many questions come to mind, but I'll leave you with just a few. Is the act of renunciation captured only at the moment of breaking away, since the next step is to join an established institution? Is this an expression of counterculture? Or does it become yet another social convention and the counterculture fades? Did the Sangha provide an appropriate alternate lifestyle, allowing the pursuit of self-expression? Or did such institutions suppress self-expression? And what about the woman who was a devotee? Was she seeing herself in any way as part of a counterculture? Did she create a spirit of freedom among women? Or did the overlay of formal religion screen the sensibilities that motivated women to opt out? Did the erstwhile, less visible Shakta tradition, now finding status and visibility, perhaps discover antecedents in the earlier counterculture? Such questions need answers. Perhaps some have already been answered. If not, I sincerely hope that some of you will search for the answers.